Local hiker and amateur geologist Dalton was exploring the rugged Highlands when he stumbled upon an unusually shaped boulder. Intrigued by its peculiar form and markings, he took several photos and sent them to a geology expert friend for a quick analysis. Expecting a simple explanation, Dalton continued his hike, unaware of the impending danger he had just uncovered. Minutes later, his phone rang with an urgency that made his heart skip a beat. The expert's voice was frantic, urging him to get away from the boulder immediately. Dalton's geology expert friend was screaming bloody murder over the phone. He screamed so loud, Dalton had to hold his phone a little away from his ear so he wouldn't get any hearing damage. Slow down, Dalton said, as his friend finally caught a breath. What do you mean by, get away from the boulder? He asked confusedly. As soon as his geology expert friend explained why he was so upset, Dalton's eyes grew wide in shock. He almost dropped his phone as he sprinted away from the boulder. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" he yelled over the phone, not even listening to his friend as he kept on running. He only stopped when he was back in his car. Out of breath, Dalton sat in his car. He quickly ended the conversation with his friend and called 911. "I need the police, the FBI, or anyone from the government immediately," he frantically said. Someone had to make sure no one would get close to that boulder ever again. But what is going on with the boulder? Why did Dalton have to get away from it? And will the FBI show up? The Highlands were about a 20-minute drive away from Dalton's home. On the weekends, he would usually be there, hiking and exploring. He was always on his own, as he could sometimes spend hours in the same spot, and he didn't want anyone to hold him back. Normally, he loved being alone, but this time, he wished someone had been there. As he hiked to the top of the hill, he saw something big and round in the distance. Dalton couldn't keep his eyes off the strange round object, trying to figure out what it was as he got closer. His mouth fell open as he realized the size of the object, towering over him as he stood next to it. "What on earth is this thing?" he thought. He stared at the object for a little while, inspecting every inch of it. He walked around it, and again, but he just had no clue about what it could be. It was a true head-scratcher. Dalton eventually snapped a few pictures and sent them to one of his friends majoring in geology expertise and continued his hike. The object stayed in his mind for a little while, but soon after, he was already distracted by another rock he had found. You see, Dalton had the mind span of a goldfish and totally forgot about the object until he walked past it again on his way back to his car. Once again, he was intrigued by the object and checked his phone to see if he had gotten a response from his friend. As Dalton reached into his backpack, he felt his phone briefly vibrating. It stopped right as Dalton grabbed it, and when he checked his missed calls, his stomach dropped. His friend had called him 15 times. Dalton wasted no time and quickly called his friend back. After only one ring, his friend picked up, screaming at Dalton to get away. "Get away from that thing, Rich, now!" Fred, Dalton's friend, yelled. Dalton asked why, but Fred began to rattle like a madman, so Dalton had no idea what he was saying. The words coming out of Fred's mouth were so complex, and he was talking so hastily and loudly that Dalton had no other choice than to wait until he was done. Finally, Dalton was able to get a word in. "Slow down, man," he said, with a smile on his face. But as Fred explained what he had said, now slowly so Dalton could follow, Dalton's smile disappeared. "What? What do you mean?" he stammered. Fred's words suddenly hit him like a truck, and Dalton began to sprint back to his car. Dalton's feet barely touched the ground as he dashed downhill, his voice hoarse from shouting warnings to anyone he passed. "Go back! It's not safe!" he yelled. but his words were carried away by the wind, leaving no impact on the hikers who glanced at him with bemusement and continued on their path, oblivious to the urgency in his voice. His rapid descent drew puzzled looks from fellow hikers. They watched Dalton, his face etched with panic, racing past them. Rather than concern, their expressions were filled with curiosity and confusion, wondering what could make a man so desperate to flee the tranquil surroundings of the Highlands. Dalton's attempts to warn others fell on deaf ears. Each warning was met with indifference, as if he were a stranger speaking a foreign language. His sense of duty clashed with their disinterest, highlighting the gap between his frantic urgency and their leisurely pace. As he continued his sprint, Dalton felt a growing sense of isolation. His panic, so vivid and real to him, seemed invisible to those around him. This disconnection only amplified his desperation, pushing him to move even faster, driven by a mission only he seemed to understand. The more Dalton warned, the more he seemed to alienate himself. To the casual observer, he was a figure of overreaction, a man lost to his own unfounded fears. This perception isolated him further, casting his urgent cries as nothing more than the ramblings of a man who had lost his grip on reality. Gasping for air, Dalton threw himself into his car, slamming the door shut behind him. The vehicle, with its familiar scent and confines, felt like a bastion of safety after the chaos of his escape. He paused for a moment, letting the silence envelop him, a stark contrast to the pounding of his heart. With shaky hands, Dalton locked the car doors, the click of the locks sounding unusually loud in the quiet. He leaned back in the driver's seat, closing his eyes in an attempt to calm his racing thoughts. The safety of the car's interior offered a temporary respite from his fear, allowing him to gather his thoughts. Remembering Fred was still on the line, Dalton picked up his phone again. "I'm safe now," he whispered, his voice a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "But I need to hang up. I have to call for help." There was a pause as Dalton braced himself for the next step, knowing the weight of what he was about to do. Taking a deep breath, Dalton ended the call with Fred and stared at his phone, the reality of the situation setting in. He knew the next call he made could be one of the most important in his life. With determined resolve, he began dialing 911, ready to explain the danger he'd stumbled upon in the Highlands. "Take care, Dalton. Be safe." Fred's voice came through the phone, filled with concern and understanding of the gravity of the situation. Dalton nodded, even though Fred couldn't see it. "Thanks, I will. And thanks for everything," he replied, before ending the call. With that, he steeled himself and pressed the call button, ready to alert the authorities. "There's something dangerous in the Highlands," he began, his voice a cocktail of anxiety and determination. He knew the importance of each word, hoping his message would convey the immediate danger. "You need to understand, this isn't just a scare. It's serious," Dalton insisted, his voice growing more desperate as he tried to paint a picture of the threat. He could feel the weight of his discovery pressing down on him, urging him to make the operator understand the gravity of the situation. The operator's voice, laced with skepticism, pierced through Dalton's plea. "Sir, are you sure about this?" they asked, their doubt like a cold splash of water on Dalton's fervent warnings. Frustration bubbled within him, his urgency clashing with their disbelief, making him feel even more isolated. "We'll send someone to check it out," the operator finally conceded, but their tone suggested they were humoring him more than taking action. Dalton's heart sank as he realized only one officer would be dispatched. It felt like a token gesture, insufficient against the magnitude of what he'd found. Dalton ended the call and turned his gaze towards the path leading back to the Highlands. He sat there, watching, his concern growing with every passing minute. The solitary figure of a dispatched officer seemed too small, too vulnerable against the backdrop of the looming hills and the hidden danger within. It seemed as though his urgent calls for help had fallen on ears that couldn't grasp the potential peril. From the safety of his car, Dalton kept his eyes glued to the path that led to the hidden danger. Each moment felt like an eternity as he waited for any sign of the officer's return. The stillness of the waiting game contrasted sharply with the turmoil churning inside him as he remained vigilant, hoping his fears were unfounded. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on Dalton, making him feel utterly alone with his anxiety. Surrounded by the familiar confines of his car, he was nonetheless isolated in a sea of worry. The daunting task of waiting for what might happen next amplified his sense of vulnerability, leaving him overwhelmed by the magnitude of the potential threat. Dalton clung to a sliver of hope that the police would act swiftly, mitigating the danger before it could escalate. He wished for a rapid resolution, one that would validate his fears and justify his call for help. The desire for a quick intervention was a beacon of hope in the shadow of his growing apprehension. As Dalton sat waiting, his mind conjured up all manner of worst-case scenarios. Each possibility seemed more dire than the last, ranging from ignored warnings to catastrophic consequences. The fear of what might happen if the threat was not taken seriously gnawed at him, painting grim pictures of the unknown dangers that lay hidden in the Highlands. The silence that enveloped Dalton in his car became a canvas for his fears, amplifying each thought until it echoed loudly in his mind. Alone, with only his thoughts for company, the quiet seemed to mock his concern, making the wait feel even more isolating and the fear more intense. Dalton's eyes remained fixed on the path leading to the boulder, his gaze intense and unblinking. He was like a sentinel, watching for any movement, any sign of the officer's return. Each second that passed without change tightened the knot of worry in his stomach, as he hoped against hope for a positive outcome. In the confines of his car, Dalton played out various scenarios in his head, trying to predict the police's response. Would they see the danger he saw? Would they act swiftly enough to prevent a disaster? His mind raced through possibilities, each more concerning than the last, as he tried to prepare himself for any outcome. As the minutes stretched into hours, the weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier. The air around Dalton felt charged with tension, a tangible reminder of the gravity of his discovery and the uncertainty of what was to come. It was as if the very atmosphere was bracing for the impact of the unseen danger. Dalton felt the responsibility of his discovery weigh heavily on his shoulders. Knowing what he did, he couldn't just turn away and forget. This knowledge, this burden, set him apart from those who walked by in ignorance. It was a solitary role, but one he knew he had to bear, for the sake of others' safety. The distant sound of a siren pierced the heavy silence, flooding Dalton with a wave of relief. His heart, which had been heavy with dread, lifted slightly at the thought that help was finally on its way. The approaching siren promised action, a potential end to the weight and worry that had consumed him. As the siren grew louder, Dalton didn't hesitate. He flung open his car door and stepped out, his eyes scanning the horizon for the source of the sound. The moment he spotted the police car, he started waving his arms, desperate to grab the officer's attention and convey the urgency of the situation. Once he had the officer's attention, Dalton wasted no time. He began leading the way towards the boulder, his pace quick but cautious. He threw glances over his shoulder to ensure the officer was following, the gravity of leading someone into potential danger weighing heavily on him. As they neared the location, Dalton's steps slowed, and he stopped at a safe distance. He pointed towards the boulder, his voice steady but filled with apprehension. "There it is," he said, not daring to move any closer. The officer nodded, acknowledging Dalton's caution, and moved forward to inspect the threat. The officer's sudden, rapid return towards Dalton, after only a brief inspection, signaled immediate danger. His face was grave, his movements quickened by urgency. He began speaking into his radio, calling for backup, his voice tense and concerned. Dalton watched, heart racing, realizing the situation was far more serious than he had hoped. Standing at a cautious distance, Dalton pointed towards the boulder. "That's as close as I'll get," he stated firmly, fear evident in his voice. His refusal to approach closer underscored the dread that the unseen danger instilled in him, even as he knew the importance of the officer's inspection. The officer nodded at Dalton's warning, then proceeded towards the boulder alone, his steps measured and cautious. Dalton watched anxiously, his breath held, as the officer moved closer to the object that had caused so much turmoil. The officer's solitary figure against the landscape underscored the gravity of the situation. After a brief moment of inspection, the officer turned and hurried back towards Dalton, his pace quick and his expression grave. He immediately started speaking into his radio, calling for backup with an urgency that made Dalton's heart sink. The swift change in the officer's demeanor confirmed Dalton's worst fears about the danger they faced. Seeing the officer's quick return and the immediate call for backup sent Dalton's anxiety soaring. The reality of the threat, now acknowledged by the police, made his fears all the more tangible. Dalton felt a mix of vindication and horror, knowing his discovery was as serious as he had feared. As they waited for additional support, the seriousness of the situation settled around them like a heavy fog. Dalton and the officer exchanged few words, the tension between them palpable. The call for backup had made it clear. They were dealing with something far beyond their initial expectations, marking a significant escalation in their response. Within minutes, the scene transformed as various authorities arrived in quick succession. The rapid convergence of local police, federal agents, and emergency responders on the site was a testament to the severity of the situation. Dalton watched, awestruck by the swift mobilization, as vehicles and personnel flooded the area, ready to tackle the unseen threat. Efficiently and with practiced precision, the newly arrived teams cordoned off the area around the boulder. Yellow tape stretched across the landscape, creating a tangible barrier between the danger and the growing crowd. The swift action to secure the scene underscored the authorities' commitment to safety and control. Dalton found himself the center of attention as an officer pulled him aside for a debrief. He recounted his discovery, emphasizing the urgency with which he had called for help. The officer took diligent notes, acknowledging Dalton's crucial role in alerting them to the potential danger, a moment that underscored the significance of his actions. As word spread, a crowd of onlookers and media personnel began to gather at the outskirts of the cordoned area. Cameras flashed, and reporters jotted down notes, turning the sight into a spectacle. Dalton watched the scene unfold, the gravity of his discovery now amplified by the public and media attention it had attracted. Dalton stood at a distance, his gaze fixed on the boulder and the investigators milling around it. The weight of waiting, of not knowing what would happen next, settled heavily on his shoulders. He felt a complex mix of fear, anticipation, and responsibility as he watched the authorities work, hoping his call had prevented a greater disaster. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the Highlands, the investigation around the boulder pressed on. The fading light brought an eerie atmosphere to the scene, amplifying the sense of uncertainty that hung in the air. Dalton watched, feeling the day slip into evening, with no clear resolution in sight. The crowd around the cordoned area swelled as more people arrived, drawn by the unfolding drama. Murmurs of curiosity and concern spread through the onlookers, each person craning their necks for a better view or a snippet of overheard information. The collective anticipation for any news was palpable, a shared yearning for answers in the midst of uncertainty. Rumors and speculations began to weave through the crowd, growing more elaborate with each retelling. What's really happening? How dangerous is it? The questions multiplied, fed by imagination and fear, as people speculated on the nature of the threat that had brought such a response. Dalton heard snippets of conversation, each theory more outlandish than the last, highlighting the human penchant for storytelling in times of crisis. Amidst the growing tension, Dalton found himself wrestling with a complex mix of emotions. Fear for what might be uncovered mingled with a burgeoning sense of pride for having taken action. He felt a deep connection to the unfolding events, aware that his initial discovery had set everything in motion. This blend of fear and pride was a new experience, one that left him feeling profoundly altered. As hours passed, the tension among the authorities and onlookers only seemed to build. The lack of immediate answers, the continuous work of the investigators, and the growing darkness all contributed to a mounting sense of suspense. Dalton, like everyone else, was caught in the grip of a prolonged wait, the resolution of the situation as yet unknown and deeply felt. As dusk settled, a hush fell over the crowd. An official, clearly marked by his uniform and authoritative presence, stepped forward to address the gathering. His preparation was methodical, ensuring his message would be clear and heard by all. The anticipation was palpable, with every eye fixed on him, waiting for the revelation that would finally explain the day's mysterious events. The official's voice cut through the silence, announcing the discovery of an unexploded ordnance buried near the boulder. The details were sparse, but sufficient to convey the gravity of the situation. This was not just any relic. It was a dormant but deadly remnant from the past, a threat that had lingered unseen until Dalton's fateful discovery. A collective gasp swept through the crowd at the announcement, followed by a palpable sense of relief. The danger had been identified and could now be addressed. The initial shock of realizing how close they had come to disaster quickly turned to gratitude. The reality of the averted danger brought a new appreciation for the safety they momentarily took for granted. Acknowledgement of Dalton's role in preventing a potential catastrophe became the focal point of the official's brief. His discovery, prompted by curiosity and pursued through diligence, had inadvertently saved lives. The crowd's reaction shifted from relief to admiration, recognizing the significance of what Dalton had done, transforming him from an ordinary citizen into a local hero. Dalton, surrounded by a mix of onlookers and newfound admirers, reflected on the day's events, the weight of his accidental heroism settling in amidst the shared relief and renewed sense of community safety. As news of Dalton's discovery and the averted danger spread, the community began to view him in a new light. He was celebrated as a local hero, someone whose keen observation and quick action had potentially saved many lives. People who once passed him without a second glance now greeted him with smiles and words of thanks, elevating him to a status he never expected. Dalton's actions soon caught the attention of the media, and he found himself thrust into the spotlight. News reports highlighted his discovery, portraying him as an everyday citizen who made an extraordinary find. Interviews and articles focused on his bravery and quick thinking, spreading his story far and wide and making him a symbol of vigilance in the face of danger. The gratitude of the community was overwhelming. Dalton received letters, social media accolades, and public acknowledgments, thanking him for his role in preventing a possible tragedy. Community leaders and local residents alike expressed their appreciation, affirming the significant impact of his actions on the safety and well-being of everyone in the area. In the quiet moments, Dalton found himself reflecting on the whirlwind of events. He considered the chain of reactions his discovery had set off and the potential disaster that was avoided. These reflections brought a deep sense of satisfaction, but also a humble realization of the fragility of life and the importance of being alert and proactive in the face of danger. Dalton's experience left a lasting impression not only on him, but on the community as a whole. It served as a powerful reminder of the importance of awareness and action in preventing disaster. His story became a testament to the impact one individual can have, encouraging others to remain vigilant and to act decisively when faced with potential threats, thus ensuring the safety of all.